If paradoxes underlie our most vexing problems, then we need to more effectively navigate these contradictory and interdependent demands. We need tools that will rouse us from the allure of either or thinking and inspire us to dance with the complexity of the absurd. We need tools that will move us from being reductionist to exploring holistic options. We need tools that will allow us to move beyond the label of both and to engage deeply with the mystery of paradoxes. But one tool won't do the job. We need sets of tools that work together toward creating a complete system. Welcome to part two of Both and Thinking. We are joined again by the author of that brilliant book, Both and Thinking, Wendy Smith. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
It's great to have you back. And I had managed to listen back. I don't often get the time to listen back to what we talked about in part one. It was great primer for where we're going today because we're really moving towards the toolkits, the innovation frameworks, and two different patterns that you call mules or creative integrations and tightrope walkers. I love these metaphors, consistent inconsistencies. I'd love you to open up and let's start off with mules.
Absolutely. And I love that you pulled that out. That idea emerged from the very first study that I did. I think in the last show, and if anyone hasn't listened, they can certainly go back and listen. I talked about how I was introduced to this idea of paradox and this bigger concept of both and through studying IBM, through studying innovation and how organizations innovate. And at IBM, I was studying how the top management teams of their strategic business units navigated both the tensions between the today and tomorrow, the existing world and the innovation, the managing what we call in academia the exploitative world, which is your operational existing short term profits, and the exploratory world, your experimental, innovative space. And in doing so, what I saw was that some of the top management teams of these strategic business units were able to accommodate both the today and tomorrow, and some were not. And what I was expecting in trying to accommodate them was that there would be all of these moments where we accommodate both simultaneously in some real creative integration win win. Oftentimes, when we talk about the experiences of navigating both, what we're looking for is like there's this great win-win where we have this integration. And there's a great book, The Janusian Mind by Albert Rothenberg. And he looks at these moments where what he says is what is the thing that enables creative genius? And what he says is that this creative integration between opposing ideas. So for Einstein, for example, it's the idea that the theory of relativity came from thinking about things that are both at rest and at motion at the same time. How could that be? You get to the theory of relativity. Or Mozart is both consonance and dissonance in music. Or Virginia Woolf, the author, it's how you think about birth, death and renewal. And so we expected that there would be all these moments where the today and the tomorrow would come together in this perfect win-win. Everybody was happy. And that's what we call the middle. And that happened sometimes, but not that frequently. And in fact, what happened at IBM, and one of the things that we experience when it comes to navigating the both and, is an alternative pattern, an additional pattern, a complementary pattern. And that's what we call tightrope walking. And what we mean by that is that oftentimes accommodating the both and means that we are looking at these opposing demands and we're making an either or decision. We're making a decision between them, but we are oscillating, micro shifting, making these sort of small tweaks between them in order to move forward. The image of the tightrope walker, for example, is that the tightrope walker is moving forward on a tightrope. They are never fully balanced. They are always balancing, which means that they're making these very micro shifts between the left and the right in order to stay stable. And they're not overemphasizing one side or overemphasizing the other because they'll fall over. What that means in our decision making and both anding, what that meant for IBM was that in order to be able to accommodate both over time, they had to make decisions like, am I going to put more of my engineers into developing my existing product or more to experimenting with the innovation? They had to shift the engineers between one or the other, but they don't make all of these decisions that they overemphasize the innovation, that they leave the existing product behind, or that they overemphasize the existing world that they can't innovate. They're shifting, micro shifting over time. And in my academic world, I talked about that as dynamic decision making. And in the book, we talk about that as being consistently inconsistent, shifting, as opposed to being this creative integration. And both anding is both.
I love that, and I thought we'd bring it to life with a few examples. So you talk about this yourself. You experienced this yourself both when your twins were babies and then recently during the pandemic, or the
Yeah.
dilemmas and the paradoxes and the tensions that we struggle with, particularly when it comes to work life and work-life balance. So this whole idea of trying to make correct decisions, what's right for you in the long term versus the short term. So we'll get back to some of the work you talk about, Jim March, and explore a core theme that comes up often on the show. But one of the things you talked about that is so relevant to so many of our audience is, for example, I'm trying to do the best I can to get this innovation over the line, some new product or service or subunit within inside the company. And along comes a weekend. There's this great keynote speaker, Wendy Smith. She's coming along. I'm going to play a core role as one of the executives in that weekend, but it clashes with a family member who's going to get married. What do I do? So this is a very tangible example. I'd love you to take us through this with the lens of both and thinking.
When I do workshops on both and paradox, and I ask people to talk about tensions they experience at work, the one that comes up all the time is work life. And I often find that people bring me in to talk about how to navigate tensions at work, but here we're talking about tensions with work, about whether to, but it is a core tension. And in fact, just to peel back a little bit, at some point, the editor of our book said, "Hey guys, no more work life examples. There's just too many." But it's so present for so many of us because it tugs at our time and our time feels limited, right? It feels restrictive. And the question of how do we allocate that time when we have competing priorities on that time? And one of the biggest competing priorities is, am I spending more of my time doing stuff that's advancing my career? And there's all these expectations to do that. Or am I spending my time? It may be that there are moments where we get to bring those together in this ideal creative integration mule, the hybrid of a mule, a hybrid of a donkey and a horse. And those are things like bring your kid to work day, but more often what we are doing is we are allocating our time. It's just that instead of allocating our time where it's all about work and we ignore everything else and then start to burn out, or instead of allocating our time where we're like so burnt out, it's all about everything else and our email starts to pile up or we just can't, and then everything starts to pile up or we get really behind at work or we've given up on work, if you will. It's about making those micro shifts in our time. Sometimes it's about going to the family event and saying, "Hey guys at work, this is where I need some boundaries." Sometimes it's about going and sticking with the work demands. "Hey guys, I have a really big deadline and I'm going to be absent from family dinner for the next little whatever period of time." But the noticing here and the reason why we love the idea of the tightrope walker is because, again, it's these micro shifts. Because if you shift too far in either direction, that's when you're falling off.
There's an important thing you tell us about mules, that they're infertile. And you say mules don't produce mules. Rather,
Yeah.
we have to breed horses and donkeys to produce new mules. And this is, again, a great metaphor because you say it's an important feature of navigating paradoxes. Creative integrations can provide effective, but they're temporary responses to our dilemmas.
Thank you for surfacing that because an important thing here is that what we argue is that paradoxes persist, meaning they don't go away. And so, no matter how many times we make decisions about tensions around today and tomorrow, that will surface again for us in a new reality, in a new way, with a new specific context, a new dilemma. Or no matter how many times we make decisions about what we do for ourselves and what we do for the other, or what we do for our work and what we do for family. We're constantly confronting those dilemmas. They keep coming up in different ways with new context. And the important aha here is to see those as to see those as a reality, to see those as possibilities, and to stop trying to resolve the tension once and for all, but rather to use it as an option to be more creative in how we think about it.
And I love this. Again, very, very visual mind. So you talk about, well, sometimes there's also mules who walk tightropes. So this is
And
where the systems start to come together. And this is where we can actually have a nice segue for the world of innovation, because you studied deeply the paradoxes and the mules walking tightropes that existed in IBM after the resurgence, after Lou Gerstner pulled the company back from the brink of disaster. One of the many times IBM have experienced this.
the idea of mules walking tightropes, and indeed, I'm also a very visual person, and so, for those that are more abstract or that like these kind of metaphors, the idea of a mule walking a tightrope is that it's not that it's only again, it's not an either or between whether you navigate paradox by finding these win-win creative integration mules, or you navigate paradox by finding these consistent, inconsistent, micro oscillating tightrope walkers. It's that it's a composite of over time both coming together. So for IBM, there were moments where the existing world was able to then cross sell to the new world, or they could use the existing technology to advance the new technology, or in the big picture, by innovating, you were able to introduce new ideas to your existing world that they were able to come together. We see that with, to your point, with Gerstner. So the IBM story is that they were one of the first companies. Too big to fail had become a idea in the United States. They were a huge Fortune 500 company that failed significantly in the early 90s at the transition to the microcomputer. And they were afraid they were gonna do the exact same thing when it came to the introduction of cloud computing. But Lou Gerstner came in that interim to pull the company back out of this challenge. And importantly, what he did was he introduced services, or he amplified services. The company was predominantly hardware and a Unix mainframe. He advanced hardware into the microcomputer. He amplified and exacerbated the software and the services, and then invited them to think about how you bundle software services and hardware with software and services to your current customer base and clients. And so he was able to then bring that all together, both amplify these novel things, let them sit next to the existing things we do, and then bring them all together.
We'll get a little bit deeper into that in a little while, but one of the other things you say about that experience is bringing it back to some of the language used in part one, was that just like Lego had got into a rut of being so focused on quality, IBM had got into the rut of the mainframe computer, even though they invented in many ways the mini computers. So I'd love you to take
Yes.
us through this, because a lot of people won't know this story, because it's a, I suppose people might think it's a little bit dated and it's a case study that's in the past, but it's so, so relevant to any organization or an individual as well, because we get into our own mental ruts with our skill sets.
And what we see again and again is that the number one determinant of organizational failure is success. And this is the issue of the S curve, or the intensification of what we already do, or what we call falling into a rabbit hole. This is the idea of the inertia of the existing world preventing us from getting to the new world. And there are moments where the existing world prevents us from seeing that there's new technology coming down the pike. And in some ways, the issue for Lego is that Lego was this mechanical toy interlocking brick. They saw that new toys were being introduced with all kinds of electronics. They understood this, but they did not think that it was relevant to them. So there's the don't see, don't invest, which Lego was one of those. But then there's the invest, but aren't able to actually create a business out of it because all of the structural and technological inertia that prevents the existing business from figuring out how do we sell this stuff and how do we market this stuff and how do we put people on it. And that was IBM's challenge, is that they invested in developing this microcomputer, but they couldn't figure out how to sell it and how to develop it at scale. The other company that is often cited in this similar challenge is Polaroid. And we talk about Polaroid a little bit in the book because Polaroid went bankrupt right across the street from my doctoral student offices at Harvard, and I saw the building go up for sale in the early 2000s, and Polaroid saw that technology was moving from analog technology and film into digital technology for imaging. They invested heavily in digital technology, but they just couldn't get over for them essentially what was the strategy. They call it a razor and blade strategy. Polaroid understood that the way that they, as a company that made instant film, made money was basically giving away the cameras for free and making money on the film, and could not figure out how to let go of that in a space where there was no film. So again, it's sometimes we don't see the technology coming. Sometimes we see the technology coming, but we're not willing to invest in it. But oftentimes we're invested. We actually try this out, but we can't figure out how to then bring it to market.
As a reminder to our audience, I said at the start, you need a set of tools. You need to bounce around those tools, use the right tools at the right time, use a mix of them like mules walking tightropes, etc. But I want to show on the screen again for those people watching us, and we'll have a little bit of empathy for you people who are just listening to the show, the paradox system, the four tools. And we're going to focus today on assumptions and boundaries. And we'll start off. Maybe just give the ABCD, Wendy, and then we'll focus into assumptions. And we're also going to cover the mindset inventory tool that you provide in the book. But for now, this is the overall set of tools that we can use to navigate dilemmas and paradoxes, etc.
To tee this up, and if anyone did not listen to the last segment, essentially, the reason we wrote this book was because people were increasingly talking about paradox and both and in organizations. And we had been surrounded by an incredible community of colleagues and scholars that are studying these ideas. And we wanted to invite people who were saying, look, we got to do this both and to say, yes, we've got all this scholarship about how to do it. And so this paradox system is our framework that brings together these sets of tools that work together with one another. We call it a system because they reinforce each other, not one or the other of these tools that enable individuals as well as organizations to be more paradoxical, to engage more with the both and. And so at the big picture, it's assumptions, boundaries, comfort, and dynamics. I think, as I said before, we spent a lot of time trying to work on these labels so that it could be A, B, C, D. And much of the book then unpacks each of them. So the assumptions start with our mindsets, how we think about competing demands and how we think about tension. So this is about our mindsets, our framing, the way that we understand the relationship. And we start there in part. This is a space where people will typically start, which is how are you framing and understanding opposing ideas? Do you understand them as problems that need to get solved, or do you understand them as possibilities that are enabling that can live together, coexist, and that enable us to be more creative? And so we talk about this broadly to shifting to both and assumptions. And we unpack that in a couple of different ways, what those assumptions look like. The first is how we understand the relationship between opposing ideas, how we understand the relationship of the resources, and how we understand what it means to manage these resources. So the first piece is we talk about it as accepting knowledge as containing multiple truths. What do we mean by that? We mean the recognition, the mindset that competing demands can live and coexist simultaneously without that being a problem. That we can understand and value the yin yang. That we don't have to see a single truth, but we can live into and value multiple truths simultaneously. And I'll just pause here. One of the things that we know, and this is going to be an overly generalized stereotype, but I want to just say one thing that we know and that we see in the research is that we have very different cultural connections to this first piece. That overarchingly, Western thinking tends to reject the idea that multiple truths can coexist, look for, it be in search of a single truth. Whereas Eastern thinking tends to live into and accept a more holistic interdependence where opposing the good and the bad, love and hate, cooperate and compete, self and other can live side by side with one another. And a number of our studies, there's a great study by my colleague Josh Keller that, and I don't remember if I mentioned this last time, that looks at the differences of these cultural norms across societies. So we certainly have research and we know that accepting that multiple truths exist, not looking for the right answer, is the first piece to both and.
One of the examples you give in this chapter is the decision between planet and profit, for example. And you have a project that you work on as well, this concept of eco bricks. And I love that. And
Yeah.
I love the character you talk about in the book, the gentleman who actually created this locally in the Philippines as well. This is
Yeah.
a great example of this both and thinking in practice.
Just to take you back a little bit, before I went back to grad school, I was a management consultant. And it was at the time that Enron had recently fallen and WorldCom, we were seeing all these ethical collapses of companies. It was at the time where social responsibility as a concept was still somewhat marginalized and belonged to like the Ben and Jerry's of the world. And I remember talking about what it would look like to have both profit and purpose sit side by side. And the zeitgeist at the time was that that doesn't exist. Anything that looks like purpose or social mission or something that's not directly profit at a very linear, direct way, like that's all greenwashing as we call it today. And I remember my case leader saying this to me and feeling like, wait, there's got to be something more out there. But certainly that was the zeitgeist. You couldn't do both of these because as soon as they would come into competition with one another, you would have to pick and profit would always have to be king. And this goes back to some of your listeners might, of course, know that 1971 New York Times headline from the famous economist Milton Friedman that the only social responsibility of the company is to its shareholders. So the assumption that you could have these opposing ideas, profit and purpose, social and financial within one company was completely rejected. And in fact, we see that in the US in our tax codes and in our corporate codes, which is that we assume that because they can't coexist, one belongs in one kind of structure, the nonprofit, and the other belongs in the other structure, the for profit, and they don't come together. And so we see that kind of thinking embedded in the way that we think. I saw this when I first had my kids. My first kids are twins, and my friends were all having kids, and the assumption that you could be both career-oriented and parenting-oriented, for women particularly, like, that was challenged on an ongoing basis, which is that you had to pick a primary, and that's the kind of thinking that we invite people to recognize and then challenge.
I thought it'd be useful for our audience. We talk a lot about mindset on this show. So this will make sense now for those who are wondering why we do shows on neuroscience or the brain or biases or belief, because mindset, as Wendy just said, decides how you see a problem, how you see an opportunity. If you see the opportunity or the solution, because the way you've been trained, the way your brain gets into a rut, literally decides all those life experiences, your previous coaches, your primary carers, all decide your mindset. And I thought it was beautiful the way you put together a mindset inventory in the book. And I thought this was such a useful tool just to see where you sit, which quadrant you sit within, but also maybe if you're trying to convince somebody inside the organization, say you're a change maker in IBM, for example, you're trying to convince somebody who is so focused on the bottom line that this new project might be the way forward, even if it competes or looks like it's going to cannibalize your existing profit line. I thought this tool was so, so useful, and I'd love you to take us through it.
Love that. And here I want to start with a shout out, in addition to myself and my co-author Marianne Lewis, to our colleagues that did this piece of work with us, Ella Marone Spector, Josh Keller, and Amy Ingram. The question we asked is, well, what are the mindsets and how are they different between those people that are going quickly to the either or linear, very quick to decision making, and those people that are able to hold open the possibility and potential for more holistic, interdependent, both anding. And this mindset was developed with thousands of people. We have to translate it into multiple languages. We did it around the world. And what emerged essentially is that there are two components to embracing a paradox mindset. The first is, do people even experience tensions? And what we find is that either because people willfully, potentially subconsciously want to avoid tensions. They just close their eyes and don't see them. Or because they're just in a context where the experience, the salience of the tensions is much lower, right? That my colleague who did this work with us, who is from Israel, would say, gosh, and increasingly now, like Israel is a place where there are a lot more tensions than, let's say, New Zealand. And so there are some companies where those tensions are really salient compared to others, and so are they even experiencing the tensions? And then the second is, okay, well, if you're experiencing tensions, then how are you applying, how are you approaching these tensions? Are you approaching them in this more either/or way where you have to pull them apart, see them as linear, or are you approaching them in this both/and possibility? And so what we notice is that there are some people that just don't experience tensions, are approaching this in this either/or way. We talk about that as avoiding. In part, the reason we say avoiding, which has this willfulness to it, is because what we would argue is that tensions exist all over the place if you just opened up to it. So those folks, like, just aren't engaging. There are a lot of folks, we say that and most people in which there's a lot of tension. We feel the tension, but we're just so stuck in the tensions and we want to resolve them, and like, what's the answer? What's the solution? And that is the classic either or thinker. You might be one of them, you might know one of them, but certainly that ongoing experience of feeling mired in this as a detrimental conflict. There are those that don't experience tension. They're like so ready for the both and, but it's like they're looking around for where that tension exists, and that happens sometimes, but infrequently. And ideally, what we see as the space in which people can really embrace this both and approach is when they see the tensions, they know they're there, they experience them, and they see the possibility of using that as an option for creative thinking. And we call that the engaging zone.
One of the things I'm sure you've learned this when you have the scar tissue of being a management consultant, being a lecturer, being a researcher, being an author, now giving keynotes and workshops, etc., is that many times the change maker or the innovator within inside an organization thinks that the idea is enough. And the idea is rarely enough. There's so many mazes you have to navigate in order to get that over the line. And I think that's what's so useful about having these tools. And
Yeah.
also, when you talk about transformation in large organizations like IBM that you mentioned, there was a quote here that I love you to riff on because I'm sure you see this, and this is one of the biggest challenges to do with more than things like resource allocation. You write that managers seek control in the face of uncertainty, but leaders learn to cope. Navigating paradoxes depend on the assumptions of leaders and artists who willingly live on the edge of chaos, developing insights with open possibilities, rather than seeking the refuge of certainty and resolution. Beautiful artistry in itself in how you wrote that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm just gonna say one more thing about this mindset measure, just so that people know it's available and accessible, free online. You can link through our website, and people are using it for research. So if there's any academics out there that are listening, there's lots of research using the mindset measure right now, but also people are using it individually, but also people are using this with their teams. Let's get a basic understanding of how comfortable we all are in this both and space, and so that's available and accessible, and we're happy to help facilitate that possibility along the way.
I'll just say while you've said that, I have a copy of the book up for grabs as well. It's also in the book, and the book is a great read. Huge amount of research in there because this is combined 4 decades plus of research between Wendy and Marianne. Huge amount of
Yeah.
research, huge amount of history of paradoxes going right back to Jung and Heraclitus. So the book is up for grabs for those who sign up to our Substack on the Innovation Show, but also sign up to Wendy's as well. She has a great Substack as well. I've already linked to it from the Innovation Show Substack, and you can find it there. It's a highly recommended one from us.
Well, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Yes, I think to your point, Aidan, and, like, it's one thing to hear these ideas and say, "Oh, yeah," and it's another thing to live them. I'm constantly catching myself in just how defensive and either or I get or how much I wanna just avoid the challenges. So as we know, living them is the hard part. So, you know, so happy to be in conversation with people as they live them. And what you just pointed to, so and a key to our assumptions is that managers have to control, that managers have to inform, that managers have to and unfortunately, what that does is that puts managers into a role of having to make choices rather than a role of creating the playing field and inviting people in to navigate these challenges and tensions along the way. And in an adaptive world, I think some of you might know the work, Heifetz's work on adaptive leadership. In an adaptive world where leaders need to be adaptive, where we need to deal with the uncertainty, being really clear and certain does not give your people the capacity to navigate that uncertainty. Now, the question is, what does that look like for leaders to not come up with people want leaders, make a decision, be clear. And there's things that we do need to be clear on as leaders. We need to be clear on resource allocations. We need to be clear on strategic priorities. But how could leaders create the boundaries, conditions, and playing field that enable people to play within but not always have the clear, certain answer on everything and invite in the uncertainty along the way. I'll tell one quick story because I really love this. I have a great friend, colleague who is the head of a social services organization out in Seattle, about several hundred people that he's managing. And at some point in his 50s, he started to draw. And he is an incredible drawer. It's just beautiful artist in the portraits that he creates. And this is all by hobby. And what is so beautiful is he said to me one time, Wendy, this kind of drawing or art in general is about leaving open the possibility as long as possible in order for the art to emerge until you have to commit to an option. That's what I learned about leadership, which is how do we create the conditions, not where we are so wavering that employees don't know how to move forward, but that we enable curiosity, possibility, and leave open options in order to move forward. Now, when we talk about boundaries, you need some clear guardrails. And you also need the possibility to be open in those guardrails.
I love that you just said that. I'm writing my book at the moment, my current book, and I'm writing about the idea of vision being like this gravitational pull into the future. And you talk about this, the importance of that North Star to gravitate you towards a future that's uncertain. Because if I have, for example, an innovation team and then the legacy organization team, like you discussed in IBM, for example, but if I have an overarching vision that brings them together, and you mentioned here people like Viktor Frankl, for example, that this purpose as well as a vision helps people get through the difficult times. And I thought this would be a lovely segue for us to get into that and to boundaries because it helps us have boundaries if we have a really strong vision or a passion or a purpose for the future.
Yes. So the label boundaries, again, a B, the idea is here, what is the scaffolding? What's the structures? What are the stable things that we need around us in order to be dynamic, creative, enable that uncertainty? So notice the duality there, that what we're doing is we're creating boundaries not so that we get stuck. We're creating boundaries and structures and scaffolding so that we can be more expansive, so that we can enable us to live into the uncertainty. And one of those boundaries is this idea of having an overarching vision, a superordinate goal. And you mentioned there's a couple of reasons, and what that means is, do we have a vision that incorporates these competing demands and can hold them within, right? And we like to use the example of Unilever. When we spoke with and interviewed Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever, who introduced the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, who I think we had mentioned, the key thing that he said, the number one piece that he said was, "The first thing that I needed to do when I started to introduce a company that was gonna commit to social and environmental to enable financial, not alongside, to enable, I needed to start with a vision, because that's what was gonna hold this together. That's why we're doing." And so their vision at Unilever is to make everyday sustainable living. And the important piece about that is twofold. One is, which is what you were pointing to, which is that it's really motivating, empowering, hopeful to be looking towards something bigger than ourselves. And that's where Viktor Frankl comes into this. Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, which came out in the late 1940s, he was a psychoanalyst who was in the concentration camps during the Holocaust during World War II. And what he said is that when people had some kind of hope or possibility or bigger sense of self, that's what enabled them to live through this horrible experience, this horrific experience. When people lost all of that, that's when you knew it was over. Their eyes would like glaze over and they were done. So the invitation of a bigger, broader purpose and mission is what we get up for in the morning. So there's something motivating about it. There's also something accommodating about it, which is that if you're gonna navigate these competing demands, these opposing pressures, this conflict, which can be hard, it can be emotionally hard. It's not that it can be, it is. And how do you bring them together? Part of the value is seeing that actually bringing them together enables us to get to this broader vision, right? So in order to make sustainable living every day, every place, all that we need both the sustainability, the social, alongside the financial. We need them to come together. Or in order for us to have meaningful, valuable lives, we need something that is both career oriented or job oriented, or something that where we can learn and grow and contribute and make an impact, while simultaneously we need moments in which we can advance ourselves. It's not, we either have this disciplined learning oriented career, or we have this sort of passionate moments of joy. We need both of them to come together. And so part of the one of the structuring pieces is this overarching vision.
People often see me drinking water because I drink a lot of water during the day, and I feel increasingly guilty over the bottles. So I've stopped drinking bottles, or I'll only drink bottles that are recyclable, etc. But I share that because it's a passion of yours, is this concept of eco bricks. I mentioned earlier on, but it's a nice kind of link to what you talked about, Paul Pullman, because this was a gentleman in the Philippines who was searching for a purpose, and because
Yeah.
he went and he looked into his own paradoxes of life, they emerged for him, and he created this
Yeah.
concept, eco bricks, which is something that you also work on.
Yeah, I love this idea of eco bricks because this guy went to the Philippines, lost, and essentially realized that there was a lot of trash in the Philippines. There was a lot of plastic trash. Like, it was killing all of this beautiful greenery. And a lot of that trash were plastic bottles. So as we know, one of the challenges in our climate is the amount of waste that we create. And the other piece for the Philippines is that there was limited building materials. And he realized that if you could dry out this trash and stuff it and compact it into these plastic bottles, you could create and use them as bricks for building. And this has become a movement all around the world, and particularly in developing countries where there's a lot of trash materials and not a lot of materials for building. But we started this, or we've seen this certainly in lots of places. We started this in our community where I wash out bottles, I put them outside my house. People fill up the bottles with trash, they bring them back to me. And the local school made a bench out of these bottles, or another school made it's called a keyhole garden. They framed out a garden for their students to garden with these bottles, or somebody else wants to use them to create a little wall by their house. So, and they're beautiful. And if people look up online eco bricks, people are creating houses out of this or creating buildings out of this. And Certainly, the building component is not my forte, but what the beauty is that it invites us to think about how we could use materials that otherwise one would see as trash to recycle them, but really understand them as a possibility to solve a problem in the world.
Beautiful, beautiful. I absolutely loved that story and the fact that you're working on it as well. So, a couple of last things before we wrap up part two of three. Building on the idea of resource allocation. So, resource allocation, we talked about this idea of scarcity. Usually, it's scarcity of resources, time, money, people within inside an organization, effort as well. You share insights into separating and connecting competing demands. A huge
Yeah.
challenge when it comes to innovation, particularly for the leaders, for the people who are allocating the resources. So you share how you are frequently asked how to effectively structure tasks to navigate paradoxes. Should people split opposing poles to ensure that the focus means that each side will achieve what it means? Or should they bring the opposing poles together, fostering increased potential for synergy? And you say here, with a lens on the paradoxes and tensions in innovation and transformation, I thought this would be a lovely thing to discuss because through that lens of people on this show working as leaders, startup founders as well, scale up CEOs, looking at what they should do here, I thought this would be so helpful.
Yeah. So here's the wisdom or insight that navigating paradoxes requires us to both create conditions where we pull apart the opposing features, value each one, understand each one, do a deeper dive into and create the time and space and focus for each one separately. We talk about that as separating, pulling apart. In the academic language, they talk about differentiating the distinctions between them. You need to do that. And if you only do that, then what you have is two, like a deep dive into each component that then fight with each other. So that's separating, that separation needs to be complemented by practices and structures to link, bring together, find synergies, connect, enable, and you need to do both. So if you separate without connecting, that's what you do in the either or world. You separate, you pull these things apart, you create, and then it's a question of okay, well, which one are you going to invest in, or which one are you going to focus on? The problem is that if you try and do this connecting, oh, we understand, we bring together these opposing ideas in this lovely way without separating, then what you find is that you find this kind of false synergy where the one with power takes over. You need both. Here's the important part. The important part is that sometimes that separating and connecting happens by creating two different structures in your organization and then connecting practices. So much of what I saw at IBM was the idea that in order to innovate, they needed their own distinct structure for innovation, separate from a sort of subunit, separate from the existing product, so that the innovation could get its own attention, time, resources, focus, culture, etc. And I know you've had on your show my colleagues Andy Binns and Mike Tushman, and who wrote the book Corporate Explorer. They have an idea of being ambidextrous, and part of what they mean is a structure where you pull these two things apart so that the innovation has its own space to grow and to breathe and to incubate. And the connecting structures then become the senior leadership team that work through the places of integration. Or maybe there are points of tactical connections where you see those points together. But again, if you pull them too far apart, you have no leverage or benefit from seeing them together, and then you get into the competition. So that's what they talk about as being ambidextrous. And at IBM, I saw a number of strategic business units that did that. And there are also some organizations where pulling apart the opposing tensions into its own structural element doesn't always make sense. So, one of the organizations that I studied pretty extensively is a social enterprise called Digital Divide Data. And they are a work integration social enterprise. And they started in Southeast Asia and Cambodia and Laos. They've moved to Africa. They seek to employ some of the world's most unemployable or most vulnerable populations to advance these populations and stop the cycle of poverty. And they do so through a for-profit business that they talk about it as labor-intensive IT work. They do data entry, they do web-based work, they teach this vulnerable population skills for computing that enable the employees to become much more marketable in the employee markets and stop the cycle of poverty. Well, for them, pulling apart a unit that focused on their mission, which is their employees, from their markets, which is the work that they did, was impossible because that was so tightly integrated because it was their employees that were doing the work that were advancing their mission. But they had to think about separating in different ways in order to put focus on each of these. So they had different roles in their senior leadership team. They had the HR person who was highly focused on the needs of their employees, separate from the finance person who was highly focused on can they be able to make money in this? Or they would bring people onto their board of directors that were highly focused on their financial mission and others that were enabling that had been doing work in developing countries that had been doing work to really put focus on that. So they had different roles, they had different goals associated with them. They created different sets of books so they understood the financial impact of each of these missions. But then they brought it together in the work that they did and in the conversations that they had at their leadership team. So there's different ways to separate and connect. The important part is being able to do both.
I love that. That is something that we see so often is that a leader might want to do that with inside a business, but she doesn't then give it adequate time, doesn't put the right link people in between those different units with inside an organization. And again, in the book, you have some brilliant case studies of people who did just that to great success as well. But for now, we're gonna park today's ship, and
Yeah.
we've covered of the ABCD. We've deep dived into assumptions and boundaries. Again, I just want to tell our audience we've only done a tiny bit of what's in the book as well. So there's lots more in there. The next day we're going to cover the C and the D, which is the comfort and then the dynamics. So consistently moving around those different tools as well. And then we're going to wrap up the show as well. So for now, I want to remind you I have a copy of that brilliant book behind me on the shelf there up for grabs. Just sign up to our Substack and you'll be in the hat to win that. For people who want to find you for keynotes, workshops, and also find all that great content that you offer, where's the best place, Wendy?
Best place to find me is on our website, which is bothandthinking.net. And there's lots more content there. We have a whole lot of tools there that people can use. We have the paradox mindset measure, accessible for people, but also they can contact us through the website as
Author of Both and Thinking. Wendy Smith, thank you for joining us.
well. Thank you.